Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I see here these two venerable institutions of the European Union, the Commission and the Parliament, and I think it might be interesting for you to know that just a few days ago, really, a report was submitted to the third pillar of European institutions, which is the European Council, from a group of 12 people who had been appointed by the heads of state and government to sit down and reflect about the future of the European Union in the farther horizon of 2020 to 2030. And since the group, the first members of the group, Chairman Felipe González, Jorma Ollila, the former CEO of Nokia, and myself as vice presidents were named, we had to wait for a while for the Lisbon Treaty to be ratified, and then we sat down and started thinking, cogitating, pondering, and wondering about the future of Europe. And that report is now available. It's available in the public domain. It's on the internet. And it was submitted to the European Council, whose wisdom, of course, and goodwill will now determine its further fate. I will dip into the various insights from that report throughout my talk, as well as other points of view. I think we are here to talk about soft power, cultural diplomacy, and I think about power as such. And I'd like to start out with a few very elementary, maybe simplistic notions that seem to me worth thinking about in terms of clarifying our thoughts on these topics. First of all, why power? What is power about, and why do we need it? Why do we need it as individuals, but especially why do states need it, or supranational unions of states? I might ask, maybe the audience might come up with suggestions. I think it would be good for us to start. Why do we need power? What's power good for? Any kind of power. What's it all about? Why are we concerned about power? Please. Yes, please.
I'm a little concerned that as nation states give their power or make treaties with supranational organizations, that the little people in each nation state will lose their ability to control their governments. Do you think there's anything to that?
So you see, the key word here, you've come up with the word control. Power is linked, and we're talking about just what power is about. Power and control. Any other thoughts about power? Yes, please. Exactly. I think that you have hit the nail on the head. The only reason anybody is interested in having power is to be able to carry out something of their own agenda. One needs to have power to get things done. It could be if you need to plow a field, you either have to have a donkey or a horse or a tractor or your own muscles to dig it up with a shovel. I mean, you need muscle power, you need energy, even at the physical level of seeing to your subsistence. Anybody building even the most primitive shelter in the most primitive jungle will need muscle power and some elementary technological power, such an elementary cutting instrument to be able to even cut reeds or thatch or something of the sort. So at the most elementary level of physical and physiological survival, we need muscle power, we need energy, we need ergs to get things going. But as we sort of ascend the scale of human development and societal evolution, the next phase of power comes into social organization. I think this is what you alluded to. As soon as human beings gather together and organize themselves socially, inevitably, just as with the other primates in the jungle, a pecking order is established. In the barnyard with fowl, it's the same thing. There's literally a pecking order with the birds, and there's an order of influence among the big apes, our cousins, the primates. With humans, it's exactly the same thing. You may have countries like India where the caste system puts you from birth into a box out of which you simply cannot get out until the day you die. It is predetermined. And then you have democratic societies which have evolved very slowly by breaking the boxes into which people have been born. You look back into European history, which is so, Europeans are so proud of the, if you like, the traditions of democracy that they have enjoyed for a while, and so are the Americans. But when you look back into it, you see that the questions of class privilege, of differentiation in society, of inequalities and inequities in the distribution of the wealth that is obtained, have been the greatest obstacle to what we now call a fair, a just, and democratic society. So that when we talk about soft power, I think this is the evolution we're thinking about. They're thinking about the evolution from brutally knocking somebody else on the head in order to take either their women or their grain or their land or their gold or their silver and grabbing it for yourself, to evolving to having certain privileges in society. And it's very amusing if you look back into European history, that when you look at the paintings in all the museums, you see these wonderful figures dressed in extraordinary luxury, in gold thread and jewels and silk and velvet and feather in their hats and so on, absolutely lovely and magnificent. And then you look into the laws of just a few hundred years ago, in France, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, you had the so-called luxury, or various names for them, laws that determined, in France, for instance, in the time of Louis XIV, how many kilograms, if not kilograms, how many pounds of lace a gentleman could display upon his person. A high-up gentleman would have piles of jabots, you see, and a very expensive lace from his sleeves and from his jabot and from his boots and so on. Burghers in the Netherlands were only allowed a strict little lace collar on their black outfit, you see. So there was a visible differentiation of influence and power in society. The aristocracy could pour as much on themselves as their bodies could stand. Queen Elizabeth I, with the pearls and the jewels, that the strings of pearls, just endless strings of pearls, and every bit of her robe covered with them, etc., etc. And then the peasants who ran around in simple shifts and sometimes bare feet. And it was all not a meritocracy. It was a system where it was all determined in advance. The evolution of European democracy has been working on erasing, first of all, these visible differences between people. And of course, you might say that compared to the Renaissance portraits you see in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, these beautifully looking people, and the youngsters running around in bleached jeans with holes in them and dirty sneakers, aesthetically one sort of longs for the days when these youngsters walked around looking so absolutely splendid. But humanly, you have to realize that there is a fundamental difference in the possibilities, if you like, the power that is available, potentially or in reality, to every single individual born into the societies now that the European Union brings together. And that has been a dream for centuries, for people to break out of these predetermined molds that prevent their growth and their development. So I think this, in a very fundamental philosophical sense, is a tremendous, tremendous achievement in these societies. And you've seen it also happening in the United States, first with the Civil War, then with the abolishment of slavery, then eventually in the 60s, the abolishment of prejudice against the blacks, and ultimately various steps, women's liberation, and so on and so on. You have these various evolutions in different parts of the world. The soft power, then, is what? If you have not read Professor Stephen Nye's book about soft power, I very much recommend that you do read it. It has a very brilliant and clear description of the difference between hard power and soft power. And if you have read it, I recommend you reread it. It's worth rereading, especially in the conditions having changed so much since he wrote that book, you see. And you might think about how would I, or how should he modify his arguments in view of what is now happening in the world since he wrote that book. To simplify in a very crude way, the approach taken there is that hard power is brutal imposition of military power and force, or, if you like, economic supremacy of the kind that simply gives no room for negotiation and doesn't give the other guy much of a chance to establish their own position. Soft power means influence. Influence that is not imposed by force. Influence that is exerted because, yes, sometimes of various advantages, but that is not imposed on others. Where the other side, because you always have two sides in a power relationship, soft or hard, where the other side has some freedom of decision. In hard power, you take away the freedom of decision of the other side. You hit them on the head, you push them against the wall. In other words, you force them to do what you want to do. The fundamental difference with soft power is that you use the force of attraction, the force of persuasion, the force of example, to gently lead the other side to come towards you, even if not in a complete meeting of minds, but in a rapprochement, so that you come closer to each other. Supposing you start from very opposite ends of the spectrum, and yet you need, for your common good, to somehow find a common path, to move ahead, in a way that will be beneficial to both sides. Hard power approach would mean, let's arm ourselves to the teeth, let's have a war, let's beat the hell out of them, and then we will go on and do things our way. Soft power means it may take a long time, it's very irritating, it's very difficult, you make one step forward, 2 steps back, and so on, but gently, slowly, patiently, you try and somehow get across the message to the other side that you are not as distinct and, if you like, contrary in your interests as first might seem, that there might be ways of developing common interests, of common benefits, of each maybe giving up a little, but getting a lot in return, and not doing it at the expense of the other, not at the expense of humiliating the other, not trampling on their head, not taking away something that is near and dear to them and without which they cannot do, respecting what is absolutely near and dear to them, and yet convincing them that it's worth talking about it, that it's worth for them to rethink what they think is so fundamentally important. And maybe there are some things that they cling to that they needn't, that they themselves might be ready to give up. But of course it takes goodwill on the other side. If you want to exercise soft power, you somehow have to show that you're not having the hard power attitude. In other words, you are also ready to negotiate and to give certain things up. And all in all, it develops into something you might call a game, and this is why many people actually come to enjoy being in politics, because it does resemble, in a way, various games, chess or whatever, where one sort of tries to anticipate the moves of the other, and so on and so on. But hopefully, very seriously, this is for the good of all concerned. And I would say my definition of soft power would be achieving something in relations with others that is valuable to you, that you care about deeply, that you think is very important and that is for your good and for your own influence and for your survival. But that you can, put your hand on your heart and say, I know this is not going to be at somebody else's expense. I will not be grabbing or taking something rightful away from others. I am fully convinced that I can achieve my goals with the other people finding a way of achieving theirs as well. And when we talk about the soft power that the European Union has been exercising ever since the end of the Second World War, I would say that in a philosophical sense and also in a psychological sense, this is the sort of path that the Europeans have been following. And in a globalized world, of course, they have come to the realization that it is not sufficient to establish sort of a common space within which, with these soft power rules, you can get things done, albeit very painfully, slowly, annoyingly, with setbacks and so on, and being ridiculed at times for how difficult it is. You must know how in a commission, what the reproaches that it heaps on its head. But nonetheless, it moves ahead, it gets things done. And here Monet and Schumann, you see, in post-war Europe, absolutely, Germany practically wiped off the face of the earth. I remember as a refugee child being here in refugee camps in Germany and seeing cities like Hamburg absolutely wiped off the face of the earth. Hardly two houses and two bricks standing one on another. Really an appalling situation. France as well devastated. Britain having to give coupons. You see, people are getting sugar and butter on coupons for years after the end of the war, even though they were the victors. Never mind Stalinist, the Soviet Union, where people were being deported massively to the Gulag and starved back home and also living under terrible conditions. The vision of Schumann and of Monet and those around him who wrote that declaration these 60 years ago was that former enemies could forget their differences, they could reconcile, they could find that common path, and how to do it very modestly, very quietly. That dream in the back of your mind, but not wishing to build the whole sort of, heavenly Jerusalem right then and there in 3 weeks' time, but step by step, with modest goals, but real and true results. So I would say another fundamental aspect of soft power is that whereas with hard power, you sort of go in there and you wipe out so many cities by bombing, or you blow up so many tanks, or you kill so many soldiers or whatnot. The significant thing about the exercise of soft power is this patient, step-by-step, very pragmatic approach, looking at what can be done now, what is achievable, what is doable. You may have this ideal of an ultimate goal, a very high, noble goal, but you know that it's going to be difficult to achieve. But this ability to be modest about the beginnings, to think about the first step, to make sure that the first step is done right and gets results that people are, as psychologists would say, they get positive reinforcement. And when people get positive reinforcement, they're encouraged, they repeat the same action, they're ready to go forward. People need positive reinforcement. They need to see results. You get results in one small, tiny thing, say the union of coal and steel, and then they're ready to take the next step and the next and the next. And I think in the case of the European Union, there's a great many steps that still need to be taken, and when we submitted our report about the Europe of 2030, we pointed out in any number of areas, and when later in their questions we may enter into the details of the sort of challenges you see for the Union. There's enormous amounts of work to be done, huge amounts of work to be done, but one has to have the commitment and one has to be ready to go step by step. Now, I've talked so far about the situation in very broad terms and then somewhat more concretely about Europe. To add to this, maybe the notion of the European Union in the world. Since you are here in the house of the European Union, I think it's fair to mention that for this particular union to survive, say in 2030, all the people that we consulted in our group were quite of the same opinion, that things cannot continue as they now are. We cannot rest on our laurels. He who rests on his laurels wears them in the wrong place. One must continue step by step moving forward. And moving forward means finding the place of Europe in a globalized world where the rest of the world is not standing still either. For many years, Europe was developing wonderfully. It had this special social economic model. It had good industry, high levels of education, extremely productive, notably Germany is an excellent example of it. Able to produce surpluses of wealth which are then redistributed in this soziale Marktwirtschaft, a market economy, but with a strong social concern and sense of responsibility, so that the surplus in society was not grabbed and kept in a few hands, but that there was enough left over for ensuring the social security nets for everybody in the population in their own age, in the case of their illness, in a situation for the education of their children. In this Europe, then, for many decades, has been a beacon to the rest of the world. And this is where, together with the United States and some other parts of the world, where development has been, especially since the Second World War, very rapid, such as Canada and Australia and New Zealand, among others, or Singapore for that matter, or Japan, since its defeat in the Second World War. There has been this globalized shift in centers of power, in centers of influence, in centers of development. For a very long time, we had a very stable developed world, and then a developing world, and then, frankly, a third world that really was sort of standing in place and not developing at all. In recent years, what has happened is, in Europe, there have been tremendous changes. The Iron Curtain disappeared, the Berlin Wall was destroyed, Germany was reunited. Countries like mine that had been occupied militarily and annexed to the Soviet Union regained their freedom. Satellite countries like Poland were able to establish true independence at last, and an ability to integrate in the rest of the European continent. Just this integration process was challenge enough, but meanwhile, the rest of the world was not standing still, and countries like Brazil had pursued a systematic project of development. I remember in the 1980s, when I was still an exile, the child of Latvian exiles, and at that time living in Canada and the vice chairman of the Science Council of Canada, I was invited at that time to participate. Imagine the exercise. The Brazilians invited experts from the world to help them draft amendments to their constitution. They were amending their constitution to include some paragraphs about the importance of research and development and education to the future of their country. There are few countries in the world that have taken that step, and at the time we thought it was rather exotic, but they took it seriously. We worked together, experts from around the world. We came with proposals and talked to the parliamentarians, went to Brasilia, had extensive discussions, and the Brazilians not only put it in their constitution and voted it in, they actually acted on it. And when everybody talks about the miracle of development in Brazil, it's because Brazil started with a clear idea of where it was going. It realized that it needs education, it needs science, it needs research, it needs technology, if it is to get out of that vicious circle of foreign debt that it had been for a number of decades. Similarly, we see the situation in India, where tremendous investment has been made in education, especially higher education and research, with fantastic results. When in Davos, I was once talking to Bill Gates about how they get their innovations and their brightest talents. They said, well, in India, there are so many thousands of extremely well-trained youngsters who are specialists in the information sciences, that they are able from that huge population to pick the brightest from the brightest, and therefore for his company it was one of their, if you like, their hunting grounds for picking the brains of that country. But there was enough left over in that country so that they're able to really make a huge leap forward. And we know the changes that have been happening in China, where basically in a communist system with a single party in total control of the political situation, there has been loosening up of the economic policies of that government, allowing increasingly private enterprise, private property, if you like, the market economy to start coming in. The world, therefore, is changing. The equilibrium of power between countries and continents is changing constantly, and anybody, the European Union for one, or anybody else elsewhere in the world, really has to keep running fast if they want to keep up and not be left behind. And the thing is, now we are looking at something at practically a planetary level. Because it's all very well, for instance, if Europe set itself its goal to recover its competitiveness, to overcome the current crisis, to finally manage to have a common economic policy as well as a common currency. If Europe manages to get itself, say, truly a common foreign policy or something resembling it, if the European Union manages to actually work seriously on establishing its energy independence so that it cannot be politically manipulated by providers of either gas or other fossil fuels, etc., etc. As it has these challenges that it must face, well, other parts of the world are not sitting still. Hopefully, they are doing their best also to move forward. And the challenge now, I think the biggest one for, frankly, not just the next 10, 20 years, for the next half century at the least, will be for us to find a globalized equilibrium where the soft power, in a sense that we talked about at the beginning, can become, if you like, the watchword of our international relations, where it is not a question of who exploits whom, or who can squeeze more out of somebody else, but how are we to find models of interaction where in any particular location on the planet, people can look forward to a sure and secure future where if they are actually gone to the trouble of getting an education, they will not be among the young who, as in so many until now prosperous European countries, are joining increasingly the ranks of the unemployed. How can people look forward to their children having a chance of getting as good an education as they ever got? How can they look forward to being sure that the payments that they made into the pension fund through all the years of hard work that they did in their long career, that by the time they hit retirement age, whatever that age may be in different countries, that they can actually have something there in that pension fund, and that pension fund will not have evaporated by somebody whom this pension fund was entrusted to as being a high expert in finance and financial management, who was so creative about it and so novel about it and so imaginative that he kept selling this thing and reselling it to various lenders, and the poor either as in the United States, you have school boards where all the future of the school, the building fund, the pensions of the teachers and everything else has been put in a certain financial fund, and they have been encouraged by their financial advisors to buy these financial derivatives. And then all of a sudden, they open the package and it's empty. There's nothing there. So that we have now, in a globalized economic system and a globalized financial system, as we have discovered, I think that the steps need to be taken for how this is going to continue to work. The United States of America developed because it had a common market after the Civil War. It joined together. France started becoming a big power when, after the revolution, the frontiers between different regions of France were taken down, and the need to pay duties as you crossed the border was taken away, and actually the same currency was used in the entire country. All this has been built up step by step. what the European Union has been doing since the Second World War also is building up step by step collaboration projects and collaboration methods, the aim of which is not, as you feared, you see, to disenfranchise the citizen and for some small elect group to sort of to grab power in their hands as the kings and the dukes did in ancient aristocracies. But on the contrary, to look for ways where one can more efficiently manage the common resources. Good governance means managing the resources, the common resources of a country, both the natural resources, the human resources, the taxes that people pay into the common pot, and seeing that everything is run in a fair and just way. In having that means, of course, a good justice system that you can rely on, and in having social security aspects, where it is not the law of the jungle, but if you see somebody drop down from illness or hunger on the street, that people do not just walk by and ignore them, but where you have services that will be entrusted with seeing that this person is taken care of. So that the sense of social responsibility is one aspect of this soft power. Now we had also, I think, in your program, the idea of cultural diplomacy. I might say that culture is somewhat distinct from all the things I've been talking about. I've been talking about economics, about politics, and about governments, basically, in these very simple, ordinary terms. Culture is something else. I just published a book of essays in my native language back home, about trying to define what culture might mean and what it gives to people. And I think it is something that is both a sort of like icing on the cake, a sort of luxury that you can afford when you're well fed, that you have a roof over your head, that you don't have to worry about being murdered in a night by your neighbors. Once these elementary things have been established, then, well, you can pick up your guitar or sit down at the piano or your paintbrush or compose a poem or go to a concert and enjoy yourself and so on. We do have this concept of culture as being something that is for the elites. Nero, you see, having the games for the population, mind you, had the Romans, emperors had quite discovered that you need panem and circenses, you need the circus games as well as the bread on the citizen's table. But the idea being that you entertain them and prevent them from getting angry, from protesting, going out in the streets, and you know, it sort of keeps them under control. But culture has this other aspect, of course, like when somebody has a garden, when they're cultivating their garden, or the farmer cultivating their field, and that is every single individual seeing themselves as a plant that needs to be nurtured, that needs good input, good fertilizer, it needs light, it needs fresh air, good soil, and so on. And this is something that is an individual process. This is an individual process where, to me, the whole business of being in a civilized society would be to allow people not just to live and to survive and to be consumers, in a sense, everything related to, say, shelter, food, clothing, even entertainment, but that they would have a chance of evolve as individuals, broaden their intellectual horizons, broaden a sense of aesthetic perception, broaden their experience of various aspects of the world surrounding it, be it the natural world, be it man-created works of art, etc., etc. Culture, to me, is the highest expression of us being human. And therefore, to come back to the idea of soft power, there are countries that have seen the imposition of their country, their country's cultural values on others as part of the, if you like, hard power package. When my country was invaded by the Stalinist forces of the Soviet Union of the time, the first thing they did is arrest the writers, the poets, the musicians, the teachers, the intellectuals. These are also the first people that they shot after the 1917 revolution, because they form opinion, they form the social climate of a country, and if you want to come and impose a totalitarian total power on people, you try to destroy it. So that there's yet another aspect then to culture. I think that culture and its expressions is anti-totalitarian. Every totalitarianism you can think about has at some point been burning books, it has been arresting intellectuals or artists, it has been persecuting those with different opinions, it has destroyed freedom of the press, it has imposed censorship of published materials, and here again we go back to democracy. Democracy is the very contrary of that. And freedom of expression doesn't mean just the ability to say, I don't like this politician, next time I'm not going to vote for their party, I'm going to vote for somebody else. Freedom of expression means the ability to have the full spectrum of cultural expressions available to people without suppression, without prescriptions, as in the social realism period under Stalin, where painters were told how to paint, musicians were told how to do music, dancers were told how to dance. I remember seeing a dance group from Red China some decades ago, visiting Canada, where they actually were allowed to do ballet, but ballet in these Mao costumes, you see, with these long blue pants and these baggy jackets. It was worth seeing. It was a unique experience, but it was neither Chinese nor was it Western ballet. It was, to put it simply, bizarre, quite bizarre, amusing too, but sad. And nowadays I understand they're doing real ballet, you see, so that's progress. Culture has been used as a means of cultural imperialism, cultural imposition, so on. Some Europeans have felt that the Americans have indulged in cultural imperialism. France has been worried, say, about the French film industry surviving for some decades now in front of the influx and the popularity of Hollywood movies. There is this business of when is culture something that is profitable, that makes money, and when is it something that is considered by the experts who are in the know as to be truly enlightening, being of high quality, and really worthwhile. That's a different sort of question again, but if we look at it from the point of view of the fundamental principles of democracy, then of course we must expect that there are some people whose cultural tastes will be, well, quite frankly, very simple and undemanding. There will be people who will just love kitsch and will be quite happy with it, and they can weep tears of emotion in front of something that, say, a very sophisticated art expert would weep in shock against its anti-aesthetic properties. We do have in a democracy this whole spectrum of possibilities, and that is also part of the game. The possibility of having access to each according to his taste and to his emotional, aesthetic, intellectual needs and capabilities, to their education, their background, their preferences, to a very wide spectrum of culture. But I think what that means too is in the modern world that now with modern technology, we are none of us put in a box of our own culture, be it the culture of a country or of the European continent or some other continent. Modern technology now opens up the door to the whole global world. And this is why there are such popular movements as world music, where musicians just love, even as they say, dig into the inheritance of their folkloric background in their own country, are extremely open and interested in getting together with musicians from as far away in the world as possible to get inspiration from them. And some of you may have been present at such jam sessions where you get people coming together from an astounding variety of backgrounds. I was recently in Flensburg at such a festival, and they just came together and started improvising, and then had a concert, and it was Absolutely fantastic to see somebody from Lapland doing the yoiks, their particular ways of singing, and then others from Latvia doing their traditional singing, and then others kicking in with jazz and so on. So, ladies and gentlemen, I do think that if you like, you could think of culture as being soft power and being part of a nation's influence in the world. As long as it is not, again, that it's not imposed. And when it's not imposed, one must remember that frequently commercial culture, kitsch, the lowest common denominator also will prevail. And that is, in a way, one has to live with it, and one has to accept that. But the true soft power, certainly, of Europe, I think, lies in all that it has achieved in that march towards democracy in its most fundamental sense of giving equal dignity to every human being and giving an equal chance to every being, regardless of where they started from, who their parents were, where were they born, a small village in the periphery of the European Union or somewhere in the middle of a central capital. Regardless of all these other factors, whether they're man or woman, whether they're dark skin or light skin or anything else whatsoever, to give everybody an equal chance. And that model, I think, that is the soft power of the European Union that it has been exercising, not necessarily consciously, almost by fiat, by the fact of its existence. And that is certainly, if it gets its own house in order, if it survives the crisis, when it does so, I think it will continue to be such a beacon to the world by saying, yes, we have developed this model, it's taken us centuries to do it. It's work in progress, it's far from perfect, there's an awful lot to be done, an awful lot wrong with it, but frankly, we feel we're in the right way. We have at least the goal clear in our minds, what we want to achieve. And as things keep going wrong, we just go back and keep fixing them, but we never forget that ultimate goal that we have in mind. That, I think, is the true soft power of any nation or continent in terms of their influence. And then you have the hope that sooner or later, elsewhere, people will wake up and realize that this is the case. But I must admit that I am not naive in the sense of thinking, here sits Europe, or here sits the United States, or Canada, or New Zealand, as a shining example of how things are done well, and everybody else will come running and automatically start imitating them and export the model to their country, and everything will be, everybody will be happy ever after. I'm afraid it's not that simple. The transfer of success from one part of the world to another part of the world is a terribly difficult thing. It is very hard. And here again, I think we come back to what Monet and Schumann understood 60 years ago. Set yourself clear, pragmatic, simple goals, doable goals, do them. Do them, get results, get achievement, and then take the next step. Step by step. I think it's the only way. Thank you for your attention.